Join me today as we deep dive into the life and career of a master claymation artist, through the struggles of making it in Hollywood and the touchy collaboration with one of rock and roll's most influential artists. I present you with a man obsessed with the bizarre, who makes a product you will not easily forget. So sit back and open your mind.
Pap Napples
XP. Bruce Bickford was born on February 11, 1947, to parents George and Audrey Bickford, in what is now considered SeaTac, just outside of Seattle, Washington, a small yet open town surrounded by nature and quiet farm life, a far cry from what the area would become in modern times. Bruce was one of 4 children, all boys, in a post-World War II family. George worked for Boeing, creating missile systems, an effort the United States made against the threat of the Cold War conflict, a paranoia that would loom over people for decades to come.
You may be in your schoolyard playing when the signal comes. That signal means to stop whatever you are doing and get to the nearest safe place fast. A flash of an atomic bomb can come at any time.
Audrey was a mother very much of her time, expected to stay at home and raise the kids, and though she did this, it came with a great degree of dissatisfaction. As teenagers often are, when the Bickford boys grew, they became wild and difficult to control. Adding to the increasing unhappiness of the parents. And as you would have guessed, it wasn't long before a divorce separated the family unit. Audrey and the boys stayed in the home, while George moved some distance away. The split was surely better for both emotional states, but not having a father in the home and losing that authority figure didn't help the burgeoning young men's mental stability.
I just could not tolerate or absorb a lot of kind of subtle abuse. And I'm not going to tell you what it was because someone might want to do it to me.
Bruce, having a deep yearning to express himself, began playing around with clay. In his youth, he told Seattle Times, "I got into clay real heavy. I remember making a spaceship with 50 people sitting in it in rows. Then I would simulate a crash. I'd hurl it to the ground as hard as I could and pry it open to see what happened to the people inside." Around Christmas, a 16-year-old Bruce would unknowingly watch something that would change the course of his life. A commercial had Santa Claus riding on a floating head of a Norelco shaver. I wanted to recreate that kind of image.
Christmas is a time for closeness, and closeness is what Norelco razors are all about. The shiny new silver rotary razors.
The very next year, he would acquire a film camera and begin working on his very first project: animated model cars and crude clay figures on 8mm film. Even as early as this project, you can see an attention to detail of motion, and his fascination with gore and violence, cartoony as it might have been. It's an accomplishment of just how patient and focused he was at his young age, certainly a rarity today. Bruce would finish out his education at T High School, graduating in '65. The following year had him join the Marines, in which he'd spend the next 3 years of his life. One such year had him serving in Vietnam, and he would experience combat while defending a munitions dump. I could see tracers in the distance, coming out of the jungle, splitting the early morning fog in waves, as I heard the bullets whiz past my ears. He would return home in 1969 and continue his craft, not only upgrading to a higher quality 16mm camera, but exploring new styles of animation, including cell, line, and cutout styles. The following 6 years would see 6 new projects, giving Bruce much needed experience and time to develop further techniques, including a trippy morph. Unfortunately, these projects aren't available publicly to my knowledge, except for an unlabeled 2-minute compilation video. I believe this to be the tree short, this the clay battle with more detailed figures, and this to be the last battle on Earth. I could be wrong, and I cannot confidently say with 100% certainty, but I think so.
I just wanted to make movies, and animation was just a way to get images on film that I couldn't create otherwise.
Bruce, along with many others at the time, were enjoying the radically changing landscape of the film industry.
Go to the lobby, let's all go to the lobby to get ourselves a treat.
What was once taboo and difficult to come by, sex and violence,
This kind, Grandma.
were rapidly becoming more widespread. One such film being 200 Motels, a 1971 surreal music experimental film co-directed by Frank Zappa. Now, it's quite difficult to explain the strangeness of this movie.
My name is Bertram, I am a redneck. All my friends, they call me Bird.
Amazing as it might seem to some of us, musicians have basic physical needs, just like real people.
Now, let it dry out. That ought to get you a little high. Or something.
It is both a beautifully unfiltered peek into rock culture of the 70s and a hit-or-miss onslaught of low-budget effects.
Centerville, a real nice place to raise your kids.
I'd say it's still worth a watch for all the cool music and creativity on display. Unfortunately, this blending effect gave me a headache by the end, so be warned if you watch all the way through. The reason I bring up this movie is for one particular animated segment. Bruce was so inspired by this part, he decided he was going to try and get a job with the legendary Zappa. He packed his things and made his way to Hollywood, California. There he met up with 200 Motels production designer Cal Schinkel, who introduced the pair. A financial agreement was made, and the two began their collaboration on Frank's next project. Before we get into their first collaboration, it seems the right time to describe who Zappa was exactly, given that he was not only of major importance in this story, but in music as a whole. Very few artists get to his level of infamy and prestige, having the honor of a Grammy Lifetime Achievement Award and a spot in the 1995 Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. The man's a legend, not just for producing over 126 albums worth of music in genres like rock, jazz, pop, orchestra, and experimental styles. Not just for having an IQ of 172, and yet having a lowbrow sense of humor. But many things. The prolific creator that was Zappa was a man who truly lived up to the title of artist, and at the same time was a man who would viciously mock the people who would claim the word, who lacked sincerity. Though he was a nonconformist and looked like a typical hippie from the 60s, in actuality, he was strongly against drug use, not wanting the harm and the productivity loss that comes with it, but still wanted it to be decriminalized.
When you take them, they turn you into a type of person that I don't like to hang around with. I mean, people just, their personalities mutate, their value systems change, and generally, this is not a hard and fast rule all over the world, but it has been my observation that when Americans consume drugs, they are instantly transformed from regular, normal human beings into raging assholes.
As interesting as he was, he deserves a separate video. Perhaps one day I'll get to that. Although there are several great documentaries that go further than I ever could. So if you're interested at all by the man, please go check them out. Their first collaborative effort, a token of his extreme, was a mashup of Frank's band, the Mothers of Invention, performing a live show at the KCET studio in Los Angeles, and a couple Claymation segments from Bruce. This was initially created as a 90-minute TV special, but unfortunately no network in the US would take it. It did, however, end up airing in France and Switzerland to great success. Alongside this, it was pretty well bootlegged thanks to good old VHS tape recording at the time. If you wanted to own it officially though, you'd have to have mail-ordered the Dub Room Special from 1982. A compilation film of sorts with footage from both the Extreme program and a concert they did in New York City, with Bruce's animations and some interviews.
For those of you who don't know, this is a PZM microphone, which is a really nice device, and it's one of the reasons why we're able to have a stereo dialogue track on this very cheaply produced show.
Nowadays, you could just buy the DVD release of Extreme, released back in 2013 by the Zappa Family Trust. In this release, we see Bruce's work appear 3 times in the Dog Breath Varieties / Uncle Meat, Stinkfoot, and Inca Roads. In Uncle Meat, we see a man gather some materials and sit down to craft a ritual dagger, I guess. He then jumps out the window and into an ancient altar surrounded by a forest. Placing the knife, we see he's released something weird. In Stinkfoot, there's only a small part near the end, a clay version of Zappa jamming out on his guitar, as his fingers move and bend in a very exaggerated way. By the end, he's got 13 fingers, and it's a very interesting visual. Inca Roads has both Bruce and Frank represented. Bruce has arms coming out of his head, and Zappa's all hairy, followed by the hair turning into his flower shirt. We see some guy probably doing some paperwork, and a quick flash of guitar playing. Even here, I'm still not the biggest fan of this effect. This goes on for a while as Frank's eye grows out of its socket. As is the case for a lot of Bickford's work, it's really hard to describe some of the scenes he creates. Fingers fighting with each other, a boat paddling along and panning away to reveal an ancient city, a demon face coming out of a pinball machine. These seemingly random images may seem like pointless fluff to look interesting, but I think it really does add to the overall experience. Like the classic saying goes, it's not the destination, it's the journey. Even at this point, you could never tell where the clay was going to take you, and it's clear why Frank saw the creative potential it could have. Baby Snakes is another Zappa mashup film, but this time I think the execution is way more fun. At the forefront, you've got the New York concert they put on, which I'm sure must have been an awesome experience with all the funky music and the crowd interactions they did. At one point, Frank invited 4 volunteers on stage to reenact a little bit of symbolism on what he was dealing with at the time.
We have the president of Warner Brothers Records, the head of the Warner Brothers legal department, and 2 famous attorneys from Gag, Tire, and Brown. Give him his contract. Get down, John.
Between the music, we get strange backstage segments. Some seem to be legitimate interactions.
And if you believe that, I got some real good swampland I'd like to sell you in Florida.
While others are more improv art type stuff.
You're a nice looking girl. Oh, don't go down on me. Not yet, please.
The road manager does a really good fake trombone, by the way. We actually get to see Bruce in his element in a couple of segments, as well as his interactions with Zappa.
And it caused the reactor to just suck into itself and bust a hole through our dimension into something else, maybe.
Yeah. Is that how it ends?
Sprinkled throughout are the finished fruits of his labor, of which Bruce himself stated it would take about 5 weeks to create 40 seconds of usable footage.
All you have to do is just move it a very slight amount, and then you take the picture and you move it again.
And it really is on full display here. Not only are these stunningly bizarre and captivating, but we actually get to see where this morphing trippy style really developed. Things start as one thing, and then seemingly transform into another. And entire scenes shift in this really fascinating way, and it's honestly hard to look away. The imagery is almost exclusively dark and horrifying in its subject matter, and sexuality is at the forefront a lot of the time. Despite the adult nature of his themes, I feel like pretty much anyone can enjoy his work, given how bombastic and lighthearted his art style is. And with Frank's sound design and music behind it, the two really are a match made in heaven. Both express their feelings on social taboos through their work, albeit with different formats, as well as neither caring if depicting such topics would inevitably hurt their chances of mainstream success. On another note, at 8 minutes into Baby Snakes, we actually get almost a full minute of Bruce's traditional drawn animation, and as you would expect, it's just as interesting and trippy to watch. Within 2 years of Baby Snakes releasing, Bruce Bickford would return to his family home with his mother, and would set up his own personal studio. Now home, Bruce could dedicate more of his time to personal projects and work he would do, but not before collaborating one last time with Frank on what would become The Amazing Mr. Bickford, a collection of various claymations, old and new, set to a Zappa orchestra soundtrack released on video in 1987. Unfortunately, I can only play a small sample of the music given YouTube's copyright system. The film starts out with a short segment of Terence McKenna speaking over footage of the workshop. If you don't know who McKenna is, I can pretty much sum it up by saying he's one of the major figureheads of the psychedelic space.
With our establishment, that what we perceive is only a hallucination. It is, and yet it isn't. It is a true hallucination.
Following this, we see a fairly vicious fight between a sword-wielding tribe and a group of gunmen. It's then followed by some more of Bruce's wicked trippy hand-drawn art. Stylish as ever. The next part begins with some animations from A Token of His Extreme. Honestly, it seems this is more of a fuller realized version of the animations from that release. A lot of it is nonsensical and hard to follow, with our lead, I presume, driving up to a party, I guess, where people are fighting and eating ice cream. Occasionally, the plot does move forward somewhat. The guy from Token wants to bring this eldritch horror thing into existence again, or perhaps in a new location. But what seems to be government agents wants to stop that from happening. Lots of random violence in a really cool clay forest environment. Then, as the story is coming together a little, we're now presented with a classroom full of kids. After eating a banana, our guy jumps out the window and goes back into the woods to collect more, you guessed it, bananas. Now, we're in the principal's office, I guess. And after some important paperwork, the prince lights up a cigarette, and the smoke turns into a really cool transition back to the main guy. Random bizarre moments transform into other uniquely strange sequences. And while that might seem like a bad thing, I really enjoy Bruce's unorthodox approach to storytelling. Just when you think you got it all figured out, it's completely shifted into something different. It seems like he really does just create in the moment, with only a slight idea of what he wants to portray. Also, like I stated before, I really do think Bruce and Frank really mix well together, given both proclivity towards the weird. It's a real shame they couldn't continue getting along. We didn't get along so hot, admitted Bickford. It was the fault of both of us. He was not good at making movies. The project should have at least had a production manager, and I wasn't cooperative when it came to doing what I was supposed to, so it kind of went both ways. At this point, the mega powers had finally parted ways. The vestiges of rock and clay were no more. But that didn't slow down our guy. Oh no. Bruce had been working on a passion project for 7 years in his spare time, which would culminate into what he called Prometheus Garden, released in 1988, and would be that year's winner at Portland's Northwest Film and Video Festival. Before we get into Garden, we should first thank Brett Ingram for creating a featurette, Luck of the Foghorn, for their joint collaboration re-releasing Prometheus Garden in 2008, which would bring Bickford's work into the modern era. Without people interested in the artist, we absolutely wouldn't have nearly enough of a clue of who Bruce truly was, or what his creative process really looked like.
Even though my stories are often very grotesque and violent and gory, there's always got to be a good attitude behind it. It's always fun to fantasize.
So, Prometheus Garden. How does one describe such a unique piece of art media? Well, actually, this time around, the plot is much more understandable, without a voice overtly spelling it out for us. The film begins, as do many of his works, with a short line-drawn animation. We are then plopped into Garden, with large-headed creatures rising up from the ground, which then are swiftly overtaken by the fog, a mysterious substance that drifts around, randomly changing things, often into strange beings. Then we see a man transform into a beast, and well, you know what's next. Inhabiting this garden are tribalistic people, often naked as they are. Our main character, if you could call him that, we do seem to follow him a lot, comes out of a dark forest. Right as the fog turns into a plant, which then spills out fluid, that then turns into little people, that then absorbs back into the ground, creating a hole, that then turns into miniature people again. Maybe it's not a great idea to try and explain this film in this sort of way. Let's hear from Bruce on his inspiration for this part.
Prometheus was some guy in Greek mythology who would, I think he made the first people. It was sort of like Adam and Eve. He took some clay, he made people out of clay and breathed life into them somehow.
I think it's time to tell you about what I believe to be the main mechanic of PG. From a purely visual perspective, the thing that makes this environment interesting is its layers. Maybe I'm wrong, but the main character, alongside various other things, will at times either shrink or grow to fit a new space. While in other projects, things just transform at random to change the scene, I think this time he's really figured out how to string all of these areas together, and it's enjoyable. This place really feels otherworldly. Our main guy, let's just call him Billy. Billy picks up this odd object the fog makes, which then turns into a world that sucks him in. Not only is the fog still spreading, but now angry warriors are after his head. He manages to elude death, but now an all-out war is underway. A number of factions are having it out. Women, giants, weird armor guys fight, and it might be the fog's influence that's causing it. This chaotic element creates armor with this goo-type stuff, and it's unclear if the women are using this destructive force or if the force is using them. Either way, layer after layer, shrinking down and occasionally growing, the violence is inescapable. Billy sure is lucky in all of these close calls. Somewhere in there, a group of agents with machine guns instantly turn into Western-style cowboy gunslingers and start mowing people down. Watching all of Bruce's work, I can confidently say he doesn't think kindly of forceful authority figures. Anyway, somehow we end up shrinking all the way down to the planet's core. It's a pretty cool effect. A little later, the women give the people some fog torches, I think, and they use them on those aggressive soldiers and cowboys. And it turns them into beasts. Why do I say beast and not werewolf, which I thought they were? Well, one of the few bits of dialogue gives us our answer.
You know, I think we've got some man-beasts out there.
Well?
Well, what if they're hungry?
Then feed them, you rascal.
Yep, that's right. The cowboy cops get turned into a pizza that feeds the beast men. And that's the end. Who said Bruce couldn't be a little playful within all this clay gore? I highly recommend, if you watch nothing else from Bickford, watch Prometheus Garden. It's probably his best all-around work he ever made. I'd really appreciate it if you subscribed, and if you wanted to, let me know what you think in the comments below. It was in '91, Bruce would work with another LA music group, Carnival Art. But this time for just a single music video collaboration, Mr. Blue Veins. He crafted a few head claymations in very much his favorite style. While I can only show you a sample, the music is actually pretty decent. Very much of that 90s era rock. Seeing as though it was the 90s, it did in fact make its way onto Beavis and Butthead. It was 1990. Zappa had been churning out music in his home studio, as he was honestly always doing. He had actually been appearing in political-related debates and interviews on television at the time, which are very interesting to watch.
The idea that the lyrics to a song are going to cause antisocial behavior as an exclusive cause of antisocial behavior, I think, is not supportable by science.
The man really did miss his calling to be a true politician, if he had the willpower to deal with those types of people. Seriously, I don't mean to ruffle any feathers, but some of the people Frank was brought on to debate use such slimy, underhanded rhetoric and really stupid fallacies.
Our families are under attack from people like you with these lyrics.
I'm going to give you a civics lesson here, but I'll tell you one thing. We must not see eye to eye on the idea of a government that must forbid things in order to protect
what is
families.
Anyways, it was around this point in his life he began having urinary problems, of which he stated had been going on for years. Sadly, this issue went undiagnosed, or perhaps misdiagnosed, for years. Until 1990, when it was discovered he had been suffering from prostate cancer. And worse, it had gotten bad.
Is there anything that you want to say to people about prostate cancer?
Well, I think that it's worthwhile being examined to find out whether or not you've got it. But then on the other hand, over a period of years, I had urinary problems and was examined and they didn't find it.
And despite this grim news, Zappa continued on giving interviews and constantly creating new musical tracks. He seemed to be in good spirits through this period, although it did not stop the deadly disease. Frank Vincent Zappa would pass away on December 4th, 1993, at the age of 52 in his Laurel Canyon home. He was and will continue being remembered and celebrated for the artist that he was. And if you haven't, maybe give his top-rated songs a try. What's the harm? No longer exists, to my knowledge, and numerous searches turned up nothing. Given it was live, I'd say it probably wasn't recorded and or archived. So in 1995, Bruce was commissioned to create an animation for MTV's Latino channel. These sequences were legendary around the time. when the channel was still doing cool stuff. Unfortunately, that period just didn't last. To the point, I couldn't find Bruce's specific contribution. However, I am planning on doing a big video on these pieces of art. Maybe we'll stumble into the one we missed. I'm sure one day I'll get to it. Somewhere around the mid-1990s, he began working on a table-scale model of the David Lynch show Twin Peaks. You may have heard of it. Bruce enjoyed it so much, he dedicated this whole space to recreating it in clay. And while it's not some claymation film or anything, it's still cool. The Seattle Art Museum thought so, as they featured it in their Twin Peaks Festival in '98, and would be on display for the next 2 years that they did the show, ending in 2000.
And I knew that the Seattle Art Museum had a Twin Peaks night once a year, and so I put together my version of that illustration. And
in 2004, Brett Ingram would release a mostly praised documentary titled Monster Road, a film following Bruce and his father around their family home in the moment. The production actually began in 1999, and once completed would be taken on the film festival circuit and would win at least 16 awards, a great achievement given the almost certainly small budget. I would love to explain it in my own words. I would love to watch it in general, but I unfortunately can't do so through modern means. You know, I've had to do a lot of digging and hunting for the content shown in this video. Hours and hours, in fact. But I simply cannot find any trace of this documentary on the internet in any sort of streaming form. There are a few couple-minute excerpts and a trailer on YouTube, but that's it if you're not wanting to buy it on eBay for $70, from Ingram himself for $100, or for a much more reasonable price from some of the smaller DVD reseller sites. I've seen evidence that it was once streaming on both Hulu and Tubi, but I cannot say definitively for sure. I checked Brett's own website, and yes, it does look like he's hosting it on a site called VHX.tv for a $6 rental. VHX being some sort of Vimeo video selling service. I respect the ambition in cutting out the middleman and moving the product by yourself attitude, but it's a shame it's not more accessible. So since I haven't currently got a copy, I'm instead going to cite a beautifully written review by Bill Gibran, all the way back in 2006. For those hoping that Monster Road would stand as the definitive statement regarding Bruce Bickford and his amazing stop-motion animated work, this is perhaps not the documentary for you. There is very little of the man's astounding history, barely any mention of his work with Frank Zappa or any other career successes. In truth, animation is just the backstory for who Bickford is today, shut off from the rest of the world in a house his father built decades before, hidden inside a museum-like collection of his various handcrafted animation elements, and dealing with both his own dissatisfaction with the world and his dad's advancing Alzheimer's. The portrait painted is one of eternal optimism and obvious defeat. Ingram is wily in the way he sets up the storyline. We have Bickford discussing his dysfunctional childhood, his parents' growing distance and eventual split. On his father's Alzheimer's, Bruce must visit him frequently, taking him to the store, making sure he's fed, and making sure that his bills are paid. Such a role reversal may seem like sweet vindication for someone who has always felt persecuted by their parents, but caring for one's adult guardian is a burden of unbearable heaviness. It creates all manner of unspoken resentment and transforms all involved into shape-shifting shadows of their actual selves. The outlook of the documentary. He should be an old master by now, the kind of clever cult guru that young animators gravitate towards in order to learn from and emulate. Sadly, he seems more alone now than ever before in his creative life. Bruce would also go on to NPR radio that year to discuss the film's release and to speak on the topics.
Well, the fact that it is stop motion is precisely what gives it its excitement, because it has an unreality about it. You're seeing the minute mistakes or fingerprints, as it were, of the maker, because it's like concentrated energy. There's everything that moves, every frame of the sequence has to be done by hand.
I think this is a good point to talk about Bruce's traditional line art projects. There's not a complete library out there, as far as my research shows. The man literally worked on this type of art for decades. But I have been able to scrounge up around 6 of them. A mix of excerpts, finished and unfinished works, and a DVD extra. Now, if you've been paying attention to this video so far, you'd be aware that it's somewhat difficult to describe Bruce's art. Sometimes there's an idea, and always it's free-flowing. The one that has the most narrative elements is the one I'll try and look at. The comic that fringes your mind, released in 2008. This particular piece is, in my opinion, about psychedelic drugs. Hell, Bruce actually pretty much says this with his narration at the beginning.
Hey, that's a doobie. Don't touch that. Don't suck on that. Oh, too late. Sorry, I warned you. Hey, now it's your brain on drugs. Yeah, something. Now it's your mind on eggs.
Let us not forget that Bruce was a young man at the start of the 60s revolution, and I'm not saying that's where his strange creative identity came from, but it certainly played its part. Bruce either directly or indirectly tackles the themes of perception and altered realities in almost every project he's ever done. And while some could write it off as mindless visual stimulation, I think it really shows a curiosity that we all have beyond the rigid structure of our waking lives. Regardless, whether you want to deep dive into meaning or not, this stuff is cool. Instead of trying to overanalyze the other 5 works, I'll just show you a few moments from each and let you get a taste for yourself.
Cas'l, which is from another dimension, way back maybe.
Cas'l is a project that Bruce had been working on for over 27 years. Not exclusively, mind you, as he'd finished most of it between 88 and 97. After that, the man spread himself between a bunch of projects that gripped him. But the interesting thing is, he's been hinting and alluding at it for years. As you saw in the opening part of this segment, he snuck in the Cas'l name in most of his works, and the ones he hasn't have had strong connections in characters and themes. So what is Cas'l really?
Gregory Peccary discovers this castle and realizes it would be a great disco. All they'd have to do is fix it up a little. Unbeknownst to them, there was still other things going on in the dungeon of this castle.
I do think the overall concept for this project has changed. I mean, how could it not? It was in development that long. Well, for one thing, it's no longer a disco like in those early logos. And while a disco is a cool setting, they haven't exactly been the most relevant since the 70s, when the idea was first conceived. Now, in its place is Cas'l, the art museum. And I think it makes more sense because of the ability to use the paintings as transitions between. Unfortunately, we don't get to see much of the museum side of Cas'l, only really seeing it in the beginning. Though one could argue we are simply venturing deeper into it. So does this long-awaited release live up to the decades of teasing? Well, yes and no. No, in that there really isn't a story here. It really is just scene into scene. And while that's not a bad thing, as Bruce's visuals tend to speak for themselves. I was really hoping he was going to portray this strange reality-bending monster story, and the yes being the impressiveness of the quality. While containing all of Bickford's favorite animation tricks and well-used special effects, they are presented in such a skillfully refined product. While in truth the style of models haven't changed a great deal since the latter Zappa days, they have been subtly upgraded with this extra detail. And you need to remember that some models are quite small. With that said, I think the most improved aspect of Cas'l compared to previous works is the backgrounds. While none of them really ever looked bad in my opinion, this time it's on a whole nother level. Never have the environments been this densely packed with detail on a consistent basis, and with clarity not seen in other releases. Just look at this miniature city. Between this and Prometheus Garden, I will say, as a film all the way through, Prometheus is still my favorite, though it can't be denied that visually this is Bickford at his absolute peak in the medium. It is a serious shame that most have never heard of this film. While it is true, Bruce's work never had any crazy success, this release really did go unnoticed by all but the independent art community who were aware of him. It took me pretty much an entire day to find a complete version online. I scoured the internet from top to bottom, only to find later that some awesome guy uploaded it to the Internet Archive. And it's not as if it showed up on a Google search or something. Oh no, you have to search on the Internet Archive itself in order for it to show up. But on that note, if you do happen to enjoy this stuff, please buy a real copy. It's pretty cheap on eBay. Sadly, this would be the last claymation Mr. Bickford ever released, as he would move on to other art forms in his latter years. So before we get into that, enjoy this quick Cas'l montage.
There are other forms of ESP.
It was in this time of his life that Bruce would take on a number of different projects outside of the claymation medium. And seeing the extensive amount he's done with that art form, I don't think anyone could blame him. He'd release another line animation for the Stuttgart International Animation Festival. He'd begun writing a movie. I was just trying to put together a proposal, like a 40-page thing, for a friend of mine who knew Quentin Tarantino, to try and get Tarantino to turn it into a feature film. But I kept adding to it, and now it's about 500 pages. I really gotta finish it. I just keep getting caught up in the details, as well as developing a graphic novel called Vampire Picnic.
The vampire story is the one I'm trying to finish up right now.
And he had been steadily working on his art series, The Uplands. It was around this mid to late 2010s period, Bruce would go on a number of small podcasts.
Sometimes I just have one piece of information, but it looks interesting, so I kind of add a few things to it and gradually make a story out of it. And sometimes there was no plan or any kind of intention to begin with, but it just evolves into something. Writing these graphic novels, I've just gone on and on with. A lot of the time I just didn't want to finish.
Yeah.
Because it would mean a shift of activity. It would mean doing something awkward, like starting a new project.
And appear at art-related events. He even was invited to Japan for some sort of display of his creations. I didn't know where to mention it, but Bruce had a pretty active history on the art festival scene, as well as being involved in a few workshops for education. I almost forgot about the solo art exhibit they did for him in 2007. On the topic of interacting with others, he actually let a few people into his home to film and was very friendly.
I've just got stacks of this stuff that are roofs, and I've got to get it so they've got, reinforcement to hold them up and everything. But then making these shingled roofs was the hard part of the process.
It was on a fairly average Sunday night, April the 28th, 2019, Bruce would sadly pass away from cardiac arrest. He was 72 years old. He was still living in his childhood home all those years later. Among his belongings were thousands of painstakingly crafted clay sculptures, thousands upon thousands of drawings, including his line animations, and a whole host of other art-related pieces. Unfortunately, his Vampire Picnic graphic novel never got finished, but the Uplands work he was doing got its own solo exhibit in the Andrew Edlin Gallery in 2021 and can now be purchased on softcover. The man was the picture-perfect example of an artist, and yet did not live the way a great deal of them do. Kelton Sears did an interview in person with him in 2015 and had this to say: "For the past 4 years, Bruce Bickford has been sitting on a small, grubby trampoline in his living room, drawing vampires on a wooden light box. Through all these many years of creating, he seemingly never lost any passion or willpower to continue doing so."
I don't mean to bitch and moan, but my life is kind of hard. I've got all these other stories. I've got this story file. It's like 3 boxes, each of them this long, that are filled with hanging files, and there's probably 200 stories in those folders.
No matter the money he had or the fame that comes with building something awesome, it was all less important than the art itself. His stories were obtuse, his themes not palatable for every demographic, and it never mattered. Yes, he wanted success, as we all do, but he wasn't willing to destroy his creative integrity to get there. And in my opinion, that's truly something to admire. He was weird, and it's okay. You're weird, and it's okay. You can do incredible things with that part of you. Just don't hide it. Harness it. I know I've sang his praises a lot through this video, and I do want to give everyone an unbiased take, but I don't know. I feel like I connect with Bruce on some sort of emotional level. A small-town introvert with strange ideas for art, and a traditionally quote-unquote sad lifestyle. I'm sure that's a few of you out there, and if not, I guess we're different. He created some of the coolest and most creative claymation sequences I've ever seen, and it inspired me to make this video. So for me, I won't be forgetting the amazing Mr. Bickford anytime soon. So we're at the end of the video. If you're still here, awesome. You're my kind of people. Thanks for sticking around. This video took me a really long time to make. I'd say about 3 months, give or take. And I'd really appreciate it if you subscribed. And if you wanted to, let me know what you think in the comments below. Until next time, I'm Pap Napples.